Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. So let's try to make sense of what the defendant is saying. This is the Yesenia Sesmas case, this woman who's on trial for the murder of a young mother named Laura Barca-Nogueta and the kidnapping of her baby Sophia. This detective who was on the stand yesterday described his interview with the defendant. First, she said she hired a mysterious Hispanic male with tattoos to steal Laura's baby, or to take Laura's baby, because she alleges she had an agreement with Laura that Laura would give up her baby girl. Laura reneged, so she hired this person. That this person is the person who killed Laura. Well, then later on, she recants that story and says that it's that she was the one who killed Laura, but it was a complete accident, that the gun just went off. But do guns just go off like that? Let's talk a little bit more about it with our guest, who is we are now able to speak with, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, now it's great to have you on the program.
Great to be here with you, Jesse.
Do guns just accidentally go off like this?
I guess under certain circumstances they could. However, I always err toward the raised eyebrow in most of these cases when someone puts that forward and expects me as an investigator to believe it. At that point in time, there would have to be a tremendous amount of physical evidence to convince me that a weapon went off just spontaneously.
Well, do you see cases, and after our short break, we're going to talk about the actual crime scene, but do you see cases where a defendant says, look, I took out a gun, because that's what she's saying, I took out a gun, I pointed it at her, I didn't have the intention to pull that trigger, but something happened and it just accidentally went off. It was maybe a shock, I didn't mean to do it. Have you seen that work successfully in court cases before?
No, yeah, Jesse, I never have, and this is a matter of semantics. We have to put a finer point on the idea of accidental here. Are you talking about a mechanical problem with a weapon? And this is, I think, a lot of people around the country, and even myself sometimes, get confused over this issue. Are we talking about a mechanical issue with the weapon itself, or are we talking about they have the hammer back that is cocked and they've got their finger resting on the trigger, and it kind of gives us the impression that maybe she is menacing this poor woman with the weapon and threatening. And who knows what the dynamic of this interaction was at that particular time. Maybe she lightly touched it. Maybe it had a very light trigger pull on it. But if she has the weapon cocked anyway, it's not going to take too much to pull the trigger. So I think to say that it's accidental is dubious at best. You've cocked a weapon, or at least you're presenting with a weapon in the face of someone, and I think that goes to a bigger issue of intent. That's more of a psychological or maybe a legal question as opposed to a forensics question.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about different elements of the crime scene that would indicate there was not a struggle, that would indicate that this was a cold-blooded murder. But I'm very curious to hear your perspective on both sides of this. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back. To Law and Crime, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. We are covering the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Kansas. This woman who was on trial for the murder of a young mother named Laura Barca-Nogueta and the kidnapping of her baby girl, baby Sophia. She was only 6 days old when it's alleged Yesenia killed her mother and then stole her. Now, baby Sophia's okay. She's okay. She was recovered by a SWAT team that raided Yesenia's house that she lived in with her boyfriend, and she was okay. But again, we always talk about this case, how sad it is, because she's going to grow up and have to know what happened to her mother. And we talk about who's going to have that conversation ultimately with her, and perhaps it's her father, Manuel, who actually testified earlier in this case. But let's take a step back. As we wait for the live feed in this courtroom, we have to understand, what does this evidence say? How do we know that Yesenia is the one who did this? And we'll talk about cell phone evidence tracking, or we could talk about the fact that this baby and the weapon that was used in connection with this crime was found in Yesenia's apartment. That's okay, but let's talk about, how do we know that this was an intentional murder? Well, what we saw the testimony of, I think it was a few days ago, and we're going to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan in a minute, We saw the testimony of Dr. Scott Kipper, the medical examiner. Now, I know a lot of you will say, medical examiner, that seems kind of boring. But no, this is very important, because based upon what the medical examiner testified to, you can get a much better sense of whether or not this was an accidental shooting, whether or not there was a struggle, or whether or not this was a cold-blooded murder. Let's play some of his testimony right now. Welcome back, everybody. So what did we just learn? We learned a little bit more about how Laura died, and that's so important in a case where we're trying to understand intent. And was this an intentional, cold-blooded murder that would fit under the definition of first-degree premeditated murder within the state of Kansas? So let's talk a little bit more about the crime scene and the autopsy and what we learned from Laura. Again, let's bring back in our very special guest, Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. So, Joseph, what did we just learn in connection to this crime?
Yeah, first off, it's not every day that you have a forensic pathologist that will go out, physically out to a scene, to a death scene, contrary to what you see on television. The fact that he had eyes on at the scene is very important. He paints...
because you're saying they usually get the body at their lab. They don't actually go out to the crime scene?
Right, yeah. Most of the time, unless it's something highly complicated, they need to see what we refer to in its pristine condition or in situ at the scene. Generally, it's the ME investigator that will relay this information. He paints kind of, if you heard his words, he paints a very kind of bleak picture here, because we have this young lady that is only a few days postpartum with this little baby in the home with her. She's in an asymmetrical position relative to the perpetrator in this particular case. He talks about her being seated upright on the sofa. If the folks at home can just picture this for a second. You're on your sofa, you're seated there, shoulders are down, head is down like this. It's a position of submission. So what this gives me an idea, is we know that many times women that are immediately postpartum are weak, and they're in a weakened state, and they're fragile, and plus they're trying to take care of a baby. So you've got this dark picture that's kind of been painted. She's seated there, and what he did note, and they said that they were going to come back to this, was that she did in fact have a gunshot wound to the head or to the forehead. And this gives us an indication of her relationship. And this is, you talked about medical examiner kind of, people might think that it's boring, but in this particular case, Jesse, there is no better example of how important the ME is in this case, because it goes to this idea of relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, and also the weapon and the victim as well when the weapon was discharged.
I couldn't agree with you more. We were seeing from the crime scene is that whoever committed this was let into this house. There was no breaking and entering. Nothing was taken. Right. It seems that the victim knew the killer. And then, I mean, we talked about it a little bit. There was no blood on the inside of Laura's arms, which they said would indicate, if it was a struggle and they were fighting over the gun, or she tried to attack the perpetrator, that might be a different instance. But sitting in that prone position, like you just said, seems to be a cold, calculated murder. I mean, that's really what it seems like. So I want to just play a little bit more of the medical examiner, and this is when he gets into how close that wound was, how close range this gunshot was. And again, this is so important to try to determine what happened in that apartment, because we don't have surveillance footage. We don't have eyewitnesses who can say this is what happened during the shooting. So let's play you some of that testimony right now, and Joseph and I are going to talk a little bit more about it. Now we're learning more about the gunshot wound that Laura Abarca Noguera suffered, the one that she took right in the center of the forehead, and now we're learning it was a close-range shot. Again, this is the Yesenia Sesmas case. She is charged with the shooting and killing of Laura Abarca Noguera and the kidnapping of her baby girl, baby Sophia. and we're trying to understand what happened in that apartment. So we talked a little bit earlier how there was no struggle. It seemed that the person who committed this crime was let into the apartment. There was nothing taken from the apartment. It doesn't appear to be a robbery. Now we're learning how close range of a shot this is. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, what do you make of this part of the testimony?
Hey, yeah, let's have a little forensic lesson real quick, and
I love it. Let's do it.
This will kind of tie things together for folks at home. It's something I do with my students at Jacksonville State. If folks at home will essentially take the hair of their head on the side of their scalp and pull gently on it, you can feel
like
how
this.
The scalp actually comes away from the skull.
Right.
Now, this creates a little gap in there. I think a lot of people labor under this idea that when a bullet fired at close range comes out of the end of a muzzle, that it's all that comes out, and that's far from the truth.
Right.
What we're dealing with here is hot, expanding gas. Did you hear the pathologist talk about a stellate injury? I want everybody at home who's ever seen like some kind of image at Christmas time of like the Star of Bethlehem, and it's got the long point at the bottom and the points extending out and up. Well, this is where the idea of the stellate comes from. Stellar is the root here. And what happens is as that projectile comes out of the end of the barrel, hot gas is traveling behind it, and this is superheated gas, and it into this space. If the weapon is pressed tightly against the flat surface of the skull, very, very tightly and held in this place, well, you have a bullet coming out that's going to cavitate this area and put a hole in the head or in the surface. Mm-hmm. But also, where's the gas going to go? The gas has to go somewhere, and we all know from 8th grade science that hot air expands. And so as it enters beneath the level of that scalp, the hot air expands, and that's why you get this tearing that takes place. Now back to this case. If you were standing at a distance, okay, if you were standing at a distance and you fired a weapon, the hot air is going to still come out of the weapon. However, it will have a time of disbursement, and you won't get it super injected into this area. In this particular case, what he's indicating is that as the projectile comes out, the hot air comes out, goes into this already created defect or hole, and it has to expand somewhere. Remember when we pulled our scalp away? This parts this area, and it's going to tear because this is an unbelievable amount of force that's going into this woman's head. Now, the relationship between the two is that she is, in this asymmetrical position. We talked about her being on the sofa, and she's firing into this woman's skull. Can you just imagine the horror here as she's looking up like this, more than likely? She's probably bleeding for her life, and this woman takes the weapon and puts it to her forehead. Now, maybe this the accused was, in fact, menacing her, threatening her. I want the baby. We had a deal. That's what she's alleging, at least in court. But this is up close and very, very personal, Jesse.
And I hope that there was no struggle, but alternatively, what could have happened was maybe she just took that gun out, fired it immediately right through her head, and Laura didn't know better what was actually happening. I hope that's the best that we can get from this, that she didn't suffer, that she didn't experience anything. But that is a really interesting and fascinating account of how that actually works. And that's why medical examiners are so important in these cases, to determine how was she ultimately killed, because that gives you an indication about how this crime might have been committed and who might have actually committed this crime. So thank you, Joseph. That was a really good lesson in how that might work. But now we talk about Laura actually dying, and the medical examiner goes into this a little bit now about how long it might have taken Laura to ultimately die, and this is an important aspect. So let's listen to Dr. Scott Kipper, the medical examiner, getting into this part of the testimony. Okay, so you heard it from the medical examiner himself. The intentional actions of another person caused the death of Laura Abarca-Nogueta. The question that we're asking, and ultimately the jury will have to decide, was, or is Is Yesenia Sesmis the killer? Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. So you heard the medical examiner talking about how long it would take Laura to die from her wound. What did you make of that?
I thought that he was spot on, Jesse. This is initially a concussive injury. Remember, he said that she was essentially unconscious the moment that happened. Mercifully, I think, to that point. He talked also about trajectory and range of fire. First off, let's talk about range of fire. He said that this is a contact wound, which means that at some point in time, the muzzle, that is the hole at the end of the barrel, that made contact with the victim. He also talked about directionality here, Jesse, and this gives us an idea, again, back to this idea of relationship and positionality of the perpetrator relative to the victim. So, and just so that we understand, anytime a medical examiner and hopefully crime scene people, it's one of the things we teach at Jacksonville State, is that when you're making comments about bodies, for instance, it's always oriented to the direction of the deceased, to their left, to their right. So he talked about that it would have been her left. Okay, so we have the perpetrator standing to her left, forward of her. It's slightly left of the midline, so we're going to be over here, and the directionality is going to be from above to below. Okay, so that he's gives an indication that it's a downward trajectory, and that it's going to be from front to back, obviously, and then from traversing left to right. I think that they probably recovered this round right behind her right ear, and that gives us an idea. It's not dead on in the forehead, it's over here to the side. So this is very dynamic. You know, we can all identify with how we can move our arms in various directions and our heads and all this sort of thing. Again, we go back to the terror that this woman probably experienced in that moment. I hope that it was, like you said, where she, you know, it was a sudden, she didn't see it coming. However, the cynic in me has to think that she's in this asymmetrical position, and she is in fact being menaced, and with this weapon, threatening, this sort of thing. She's got her already in this position, and she's got the weapon essentially pressed to this poor woman's forehead.
Right. But here, let me ask you this. Is it possible, have you seen a circumstance where somebody could be shot at a close range like that, maybe even if the gun is pressed to her forehead, and they survive? Is it possible that they're not immediately killed from that? Perhaps they survive for a few moments. Perhaps they survive in general. Have you seen that ever happen? Because the reason that's interesting here is, even if this was an accident and the gun went off, why didn't Yesenia immediately call police? Why didn't she call medical help? Obviously, the prosecution is saying because she wanted her dead. But I'm curious, is it possible that Laura could have survived for a few moments?
Yeah, and survive is relative. Quality of life, this sort of thing. And is this woman who is already, obviously, I hope she's not out killing or has been killing other people. This is a rather unusual position to be in. You have to factor that dynamic into it. Maybe she's a bit shocky after this happens.
Right.
Could this victim have had, like, what we refer to as agonal respirations? Keep in mind what areas of the brain this round affected. We're talking from left to right and from above to below, and it's essentially transecting or going across. So you're going to get into an area back here in the brain that's kind of, it's not exactly our primal brain, but it takes care of some of our very basic needs, the autonomic nervous system. This is a concussive injury. It's very insulting. So I would think that death would have come upon her very, very quickly, Jesse.
Well, again, we just hope that she didn't suffer anything. I hope she wasn't menaced. I hope that this was a quick shot, and that she didn't suffer anything, because that's as horrific and tragic as this case is, especially when you think about baby Sophia growing up without a mother. Yeah. You just hope that this was as painless as possible for the victim. But talking about people that are going through the tragedy of this, we're going to play the testimony right now of Manuel Antonio Gonzalez. This is the father of baby Sophia and the boyfriend of Laura Abarca Nogueta. He was the person who walked in on this crime scene. So imagine walking in and seeing your whole life shattered. Not only is your girlfriend dead on the couch, but your baby is missing from the entire apartment. Let's play some of his testimony right now. That was the testimony of Manuel Antonio Gonzalez, the father of baby Sophia, who was kidnapped, and the boyfriend of Laura Abarca Nogueta. His girlfriend was killed. Yesenia says this is on trial for this murder and kidnapping. Horrible situation when you hear about this father who walked in on this horrific crime scene. Before we go to our next break, I just want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I'm sure in your experience, in your years of investigating a lot of these different crimes and looking at a lot of these different autopsies and just dealing with different witnesses who are involved in this, especially witnesses who see the crime scene, what do you think about family members who walk in and see the worst situation they could possibly see? I mean, this guy walked in and his girlfriend was dead and his baby was missing. So in your experience, as opposed to just having a random stranger finding a body, having a family member walk in and see this, what are your thoughts?
I can be rather verbose sometimes. Words, anything that I would say would fail the description of this. Working for the coroner in New Orleans and for later in my career working for the ME in Atlanta, I did come across these events where family members encounter the remains in some of the most horrific circumstances, and it is. It goes beyond the pale, and lots of times the families, most of the time, they're in this kind of state of shock. I've actually seen people that become catatonic spontaneously as a result of it, because I think that the brain just kind of shuts down. It is horrible, and this scene would have been horrible for him to have witnessed because he would have seen the trauma. And then you add this extra layer to it of this precious little angel that has been spirited away and is nowhere to be found. And you can imagine just that parental urge to go and try to make sure that this child is safe. I can't imagine the horror that crept over this man. And he would have to continue to relive this over and over again. And I'm sure that being on stand didn't help this at all.
Not at all. It helped the jury understand what was going on, but it's unimaginable to think about what this man is going through, and more, not even that, having to explain to his daughter what happened to his mother, what happened to her mother. That is no easy task. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, again, we are waiting for the live feed in this very case, the Sesmes case, but that is not the only case that we're covering here on Law and Crime. We're also covering the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina, a district attorney who's got some explaining to do. We'll take a quick break. We'll talk about it more. Usually on Law and Crime, we see district attorneys in front of the courtroom, speaking to the jury, speaking to witnesses. You don't see them in the witness box, which makes this case out of North Carolina so interesting to follow. So again, Wallace Bradsher was a district attorney who's on trial. Listen to all of his charges: felony obtaining property by false pretense, aiding and abetting, conspiracy, 3 counts of obstruction of justice, and misdemeanor failure to discharge the duties of his office, because it is alleged that he hired Craig Blitzer's wife, who you just saw on the stand, for a no-show job. Basically hired her, paid her when she really wasn't doing any work. So you have Craig Blitzer, who was also charged. He pled guilty, and now he's testifying against Bradsher. What an interesting case, especially from an attorney perspective. I'm an attorney. I don't like to see this. I expect better. But let's talk a little bit more about this with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. We were talking about in the break that, look, there's no dead body here, Joseph. But there's another interesting aspect that I want you to touch upon. You said you were a government employee for a long period of time. Would you ever do anything like this, Joseph?
No. I try to avoid anything like this. I don't want to. I don't look good in orange. One of the problems I think that a lot of people don't realize, you're tempted in many ways because you're in a position as a government official to see things that other people aren't privy to see, and sometimes people take advantage of those roles. But there's a bigger issue here, Jesse. We live in an interesting world, and many people, I think, would like to think they could hold their public officials to a higher standard, particularly when you're talking about an individual that is the chief prosecutor for a jurisdiction.
Right.
These are the people that are literally there, at least in a secular sense, to determine the difference between right and wrong, those things that are wrong. So it bleeds over into other cases. It questions. And I think moving forward, and I guess maybe I'm asking you this question, is there a possibility that if he is found guilty in this case, could this compromise other cases that he prosecuted, that either one of these fellows prosecuted? Let's remember, they've been charged with a conspiracy. Conspiracy takes a minimum of 2 people, sometimes 3. You've got the wives involved in this too. So it's and you can only imagine, these courthouses, this sort of thing, any office in government, they're like this little web, this little community that's contained. Trust me, people were talking about this. They were talking about it. There's probably people that are anxious to get on the stand to talk about this because people feel slighted. And there'll be people that support these people no matter what happens. They'll jump on the stand or go before a microphone and say whatever they can, talk about them being pure as the driven snow. And so it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? And as a forensics guy, I look at this and I think about all the hard work that the women and men out there do on a daily basis to try to just keep the ship righted, because cases never stop. And you look into this guy's eyes and you think, okay, well, I'm the guy out on the beat and I'm trying to enforce law and prosecute, have cases prosecuted. How do I know that, at some point in time that those decisions to prosecute or not prosecute were dependent upon decisions he was making because he's corrupted now?
It's an interesting question, and the way that I would see it is, I would say, well, how did his actions here affect those other cases? Because, he did talk about in his opening statement having a very high success rate, how the crime went down, and maybe that's true, and I would love to see the connection between doing something improper in this case and how it might have affected other cases. I will say, if he is convicted and he is sent to jail, I wonder what his neighbors in the prison might say, and hopefully they don't recognize him, because that might be a totally different situation. And look, you don't want to be in that position, let alone this. And when you have 2 lawyers who understand the ethics rules and are working their way in between it to try to get the best of it, it's a problem. It's a problem to say, oh, I didn't know anything I was doing was illegal. I was trying to do the right thing. So it's interesting to see.
Jesse, let me remind you of one case that this brings to mind. This is another North Carolina case, and this has to go to the Duke lacrosse team. Do you remember that prosecutor?
Right.
And how deep he got in it relative to ethics issues, and I think that was quite striking as well.
Right. Listen, as a defense attorney, you're always going to hope that the prosecution violates some procedural rule, because that would be grounds for a new trial or grounds for an appeal, and you're always trying to look for that. Whether or not any of this had an impact on any of the cases that he prosecuted, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. This is just the beginning part of this saga, and we expect that Craig Blitzer will come back on the stand today. And in fact, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We have a live feed in this courtroom. I just got an update right now. And Craig Blitzer, his co-conspirator, is back on the stand. So let's go live into the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina. Well, you don't see this every day. A district attorney who's the defendant cross-examining his co-conspirator. Very interesting case. Unfortunately, we have to say so long to Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, thank you so much for your perspective on both the Sesmas case as well as this one.
Thank you, my friend. You guys have a great day.
You too. All right, everybody, we're going to jump back into that courtroom. We don't want you to miss anything. This, again, is the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina.